I looked up to her because she was always getting some award, always being honored for something when she became like senior high, maybe. Could have been in junior high, but I'm just aware of it in senior high. She had a lot of awards. She won a trip to New York with the United Nations. She was always doing something positive. My friends and I would emulate her because she would put a book on her head and for her posture, to have good posture. And when she walked up and down the street, one of our neighbors would say, "Look at Diane, walking up that street all straight and tall. Look at her posture." So my friends, my age, we would look at her and try to be like that. I am so thankful that she was here 22 years, and it must have been to bring us her gift of writing, because she was an amazing writer.
I mean, it was very unusual for a book by a young writer, an unknown young writer, but it was a smart move because it sold a lot of copies. I mean, it was very popular when it came out, and then it was banned by the fascists. It was they didn't like all that freedom for women.
Hello and welcome. I'm Elena Lappin, and this is a new episode of Shop Talk with Writers, your monthly dose of conversations with authors about the stories behind their books. This episode is called Resurrections, and it is a little different because we'll be talking about two writers from another era whose work has only recently been rediscovered with renewed relevance and urgency. In our own very hard times, I find it helpful and hopeful to read books written at a different, perhaps no less difficult time in history. Diane Oliver was a masterful young short story writer who died tragically in 1966 at the very young age of 22. Her stories capture the lives of African American families during the racism of the Jim Crow era in the American South. A few years ago, British literary agent Elise Dilsworth came across Diane Oliver's stories published in her lifetime and was so impressed by their remarkable timeless quality that she decided to try and investigate if her family might have more of her unpublished writing. She managed to find her sister and niece living in North Carolina, and the result was a new publication of Diane Oliver's short stories titled Neighbors and Other Stories. The author's sister, Cheryl Oliver, spoke to me about her memories of Diane and why her writing is so meaningful today. Cheryl Oliver, thank you for joining us on Shop Talk with Writers podcast to speak about your sister, Diane Oliver, the author of a collection called Neighbors and Other Stories. I'd like to tell you how I came across this collection. Just after lockdown, one of the first sort of coffee meetings I had was with my friend Elise Dilsworth, who is a British literary agent. And I said, "What are you working on? What's happening?" And she said, "The most exciting thing that's happening for me right now is I discovered this writer who I'd never heard of before, who had tragically died at a very young age and had published a few stories in her lifetime. And I managed to find her sister or her niece or both via Facebook. And it turns out that there are other manuscripts, and she said she was hoping to create a book out of all of that, or to make it happen, or help to make it happen. Well, here we are some time later. She has managed it with your help and with the interest of various publishers, both in the United Kingdom and in America and in Europe, I believe, in some translations. That book has been published, and I think it's absolutely brilliant. It is so beautiful. So I'd like to talk to you about your sister. Would she have been your younger sister, older sister?
She was my older sister. I was the younger pest.
She was. So how many of you were there in the family?
Just two of us.
Just the two of you.
And we were 5 years apart.
5 years apart. So she was 5 years older than yourself. So you were 5 years. So you must have remembered her very well.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was she like as an older sister?
She was somebody that I admired and thought that she was good at everything she touched. She was very creative. I thought that she would be a designer because she had a doll that she dressed. She designed their clothes. She made a closet out of aluminum foil for the doll's clothes. But I was surprised that she went into writing, but she did read all the time. She read when everybody else was looking at TV or playing games. She was reading. So I'm not surprised that that would turn into writing as I think about it.
Do you remember what she was reading at the time?
I remember she had read all of the books in the Black Library by the time she was in middle school. And so they had to arrange for her to get books from the main library. So she read everything. But I do remember as a preteen, she wanted to read The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. And my mother was all against that. Well, some kind of way she found a way to get that book and read it. And of course my parents found out later, but what could they do?
And at what age did she actually begin writing? Do you know?
I would guess in high school. She was an editor at West Charlotte. When she was in junior high, I would have been in elementary, not paying a lot of attention to what she was doing, other than reading.
So I have a brother who's 6 years younger than myself, and he basically grew up on me telling him stories that I invented specifically for him. Did your sister do that for you?
Not in complete stories, but I can remember us playing a game where we would make up comic book titles to go with people. And I can remember that one of my mother's friends had been engaged for like 10 years, and Diane made up some romantic story as her ring went from one finger to the other, da-da-da-da-da. But I remember those kinds of games with her, but I don't remember her actually telling me any stories.
She must have had an incredible imagination in everything she did. Your father was a teacher, and your mother was a piano teacher or musician, is that right?
Right.
And I find that she writes with musical cadences,
That's
her
not
language.
surprising. I never thought about it, but my mom taught piano at our home.
Oh,
So music was always in the house. The piano might have been going on while my dad was listening to Ella Fitzgerald and that era of music, Julie London, music that I learned to love. So our house was full of music. I didn't see a lot of TV growing up because it was in the room next to where the piano studio was. So it was too hard to hear. So that led both of us to make other choices. Since we couldn't really look at TV, we had to be creative in what we did.
well, but her language sings, What I meant to say was her language is so musically perfect. It's pitch perfect. The voices, that her characters speak and the sentences that she writes, every sentence really rings with music to me. So
Wow.
I can feel that she had music in her veins.
Well, I would never see that. I'm glad you pointed that out to me because that is interesting. But personally, she had a beautiful soprano voice.
Oh.
She had a high voice like a little bird that she participated in the children's choir. But she never really pursued music.
So how was her life in school, in high school, and then later on university? How happy was she?
Oh, I think she was happy, had friends, she had a social life.
Yeah.
She wasn't as social as I was. We were sort of opposites, but she was
Oh.
social enough. She had friends. She went to parties, and she enjoyed life.
And when she went to university, she went to, where did she go to university, actually?
University of North Carolina at Greensboro. So she was only about an hour and a half away from home.
Did she come home often
She
or?
did. I mean,
Yeah.
not every weekend, but we saw her, and I would go during the year. I would spend at least one weekend with her on campus. I was in, by the time she was in college, I was in high school. So I could really appreciate those visits at that time.
And what did your parents think of her writing? Were they supportive?
Very
What?
supportive. In fact, when she passed, my mother spent a lot of time, years, sending her stories to different publishing companies.
Oh, and what happened?
Oh, rejections.
It's completely incomprehensible to me that that happened. I saw in an interview that you gave to one of your, I think, local television stations, where there's you show the trunk with her
Oh, yeah.
writings and everything that you preserved and always had with you. So would that have been, or is it still full of her writings? And
Oh, I've taken out the box since I've met Elise. I've taken
oh,
that box and dismantled it. We've been all through that box.
oh,
But her
excellent.
stories are what was so precious that I made a point of keeping and making sure I had her stories more so than the other things.
Well, you've done an amazing job, and it's fantastic that you've done that. Thank you very much. So Elise has visited you, has she?
Oh
She's
no, this
no,
was through Zoom. I feel like I
Susan.
know her
Yeah,
because we have Zoomed so
yeah.
many times.
Okay,
Right, but I haven't had the pleasure of meeting her yet.
she's wonderful. I wanted to ask you what was Diane's sort of place in the family?
Oh, she was well respected because she used her brain to do her best. I looked up to her because she was always getting some award, always being honored for something when she became like senior high, maybe. Could have been in junior high, but I'm just aware of it in senior high. She had a lot of awards. She won a trip to New York with the United Nations. She was always doing something positive. My friends and I would emulate her because she would put a book on her head and for her posture, to have good posture. And when she walked up and down the street, one of our neighbors would say, "Look at Diane, walking up that street all straight and tall. Look at her posture." So my friends, my age, we would look at her and try to be like that. So I'd say she was a very positive influence, but I didn't even realize it at the time.
Well, in several of her stories, there is an older sister who is very concerned about a younger sibling and has a role to play in their upbringing, different kinds of families. So I can sense that this is something she knew very well, that sort of role. Um,
Yes.
and by the way, what did you grow up to be?
Well, I majored in business in college. Really didn't find a job, but my first job was court counselor with crazy hours. Since I was going to be a parent, that was not going to work. So I went back to school and ended up in education.
Oh,
I started as an elementary teacher and ended up as an elementary principal.
so going back to Diane's writing, the first story in the book, Neighbors, is, I had to begin it and continue and then begin again several times because it makes for really painful reading. I,
Mm.
I feel that she captured, um, she took political events, she took social, political, historical circumstances and translated them so intimately into real lives within families. The there was 1964. We're talking, I don't know how would she have been 20 years old when that
She was born in 43.
43. So her stories actually take place in different times, don't they? But specifically, she is writing about the impact of the Brown
Civil
versus
rights.
civil rights and the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas decision by the Supreme Court, and how that did not immediately or for a long time translate into acceptance, but on the contrary, resistance with violence, with hatred. And so the first story, which is about a very young Black boy in primary school who's being sent to a school that is officially no longer segregated, but obviously still is, and he's the only boy there. How painful, how frightening, how courageous that situation was. But the way she describes it, you are simply there. She achieves that thing that only the greatest writers achieve, which is to simply write in such a way that the author connects with the reader in such an immediate manner that the reader is with you in that life that they are describing. And that's what happens there. So the fear that I felt for that boy, for the whole family, from the point of view of the older daughter who has responsibility to kind of hold things together, to experience the fear, but also the courage that her parents are trying to exhibit. It is masterful. I don't know if I've read anything else on this subject of civil rights and segregation that has had such a deep impact
Wow.
on me as a reader. And also what's very interesting is how her imagination works. Diane Oliver's imagination, literary imagination, is astounding. She can take a story that begins in a simple way, for example, a young woman entering college and ending up living in a closet.
Yeah.
It's surreal. But as you read the story, you feel, well, yes, that's the only thing she could have done. And then you think back to the beginning of that story and you realize, my goodness, the signs were there all the time. When she arrived there, she arrived with so much anticipation of how difficult it would be that she brought a whole zoo of stuffed animals with her, and she lived in her own world, within that world that she could not join or enter. Incredible scenes and incredible characters. I think she was an absolutely magical writer and talent. And so, I'd like to say to Elise, a big thank you for rediscovering your sister's writing, and to yourself and your family for preserving it. Do you know if she was working on a novel or planning a novel?
I have pieced together that when she passed, that she was beginning to make a transition from short stories to a novel.
Oh,
I saw that her writing changed. She wasn't writing about civil rights with this last story.
Yeah.
It was more, I believe, about her experiences at the University of Iowa's workshop. I think that is when she made a transition in a way from student to adult. When she was a student in Greensboro, she's an hour from her parents. You're still seen by people who know you. You go to Iowa's workshop and you are free to be you in any way that you can. And I believe that's what happened. I believe she made a transition in her writing and in her life while she was at the writer's workshop in Iowa.
Did she manage in her short life to find love, someone to love?
I know of one long distance interest, and I don't think it worked out. I found a picture of her with a guy when she was at Iowa. I sent it to a friend of hers who didn't recognize him. So I really don't know about her love life.
And, since her rediscovery, so many young writers are seeing her and are writing about her as a kind of model that they didn't know they had until they discovered her. So, for example, in this edition that I have, you see, this is the.
Oh, yeah, I have
this
that.
is, yeah,
Yeah.
you have that. So this comes with a foreword by Tayari Jones,
Yes.
who describes Diane Oliver, your sister, as one of my literary foremothers. And she writes in the foreword why that is. So I was wondering if you could tell me, in your view, why is your sister's writing so relevant today and so easily understood today?
Actually, we grew up in the 60s. Have things really changed? But it's a different kind of fear now. In the 60s, a house was bombed 2 streets over. When 4 bombings were in the city, Dr. Hawkins lived in our neighborhood. That was terrifying, but it's not as terrifying as today is in this world I'm in today.
So it's gotten worse.
Today, yes.
Yeah. So you think this is why young writers today, young readers today, or just readers today, not just young, but, contemporary readers, what do you think they can find in Diane's writing that can inspire them to look at the world we live in today?
She was a deep thinker.
Yeah.
I think if you try to connect with your spirituality, I think that you have a better chance of achieving her imagination, what she was trying to say.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with that. And I find it, reading her book, I felt a deep understanding of what was going on and the horror of it. But I didn't sense hopelessness.
No.
I didn't sense that. I felt that she wasn't communicating to the world, this is the way it has to be, this is the way it is. No, I felt that, on the contrary, she would inspire a need for change and a need for finding strength in the sight of such evil. And yet today, are we starting from scratch? Are we going back to something even worse? What is your feeling?
I think it will get worse before it gets better as of today. Regarding Diane's writings, she wrote about family members, friends, people that she knew. So I think that's why she was able to get their personality down to a T, because they really existed. Therefore, my mom did not want any of her stories published because they were about family members and friends. But now most of those people have passed. So my mom would be elated to have all of those stories published now. I will read an excerpt from Neighbors by Diane Oliver. Ellie looked out the window. The darkness was turning to gray, and the hurt feeling was disappearing. As she sat there, she could begin to look at the kitchen matter-of-factly. Although the hands of the clock were just a little past 5:30, she knew somebody was going to have to start cleaning up and cook breakfast. She stood and tipped across the kitchen to her parents' bedroom. "Mama," she whispered, standing near the door of Tommy's room. At the sound of her voice, Tommy made a funny, throaty noise in his sleep. Her mother motioned for her to go out and be quiet. Ellie knew then that Tommy had just fallen asleep. She crept back to the kitchen and began picking up the dishes that could be salvaged, being careful not to go into the living room. She walked around her father, leaving the broken glass from the bomb underneath the kitchen table. "You want some coffee?" she asked. He nodded silently. In strange contrast, she thought to the water faucet that turned on with a loud gurgling noise. While she let the water run to get hot, she measured out the instant coffee in one of the plastic cups. Next door, she could hear people moving around in the Williamses' kitchen, but they too seemed much quieter than usual. "You reckon everybody knows by now?" she asked, stirring the coffee and putting the saucer in front of him. "Everybody will know by the time the city paper comes out," he said. "Somebody was here last night from the Observer. Guess he'll make front page." She leaned against the cabinet for support, watching him trace endless circles in the brown liquid with the spoon. "Sergeant Kern says they'll almost have the whole force out here tomorrow," he said. "Today," she whispered. Her father looked at the clock and then turned his head. "When's your mother coming back in here?" finally picking up the cup and coffee to drink. "Tommy's just off to sleep," she answered. "I guess she'll be in here when he's asleep for good." "Jim," she sounded very timid, "what are we going to do?" Yet as Ellie turned toward her, she noticed her mother's face was strangely calm as she looked down on her husband. Ellie continued standing by the door, listening to them talk. Nobody asked the question to which they all wanted to answer. "I keep thinking," her father said finally, "that the policemen will be with him all day. They couldn't hurt him inside the school building without getting some of their own kind." "But he'll be in there all by himself," her mother said softly. 100 policemen can't be a little boy's only friends." She watched her father wrap his calloused hands, still splotched with machine oil, around the salt shaker on the table. The question is, did Tommy go to school the next day?
Thank you so much, Cheryl. That was absolutely beautiful. I wanted to ask you, is it okay if I ask you about how she died?
It's okay.
Yeah.
She was at a party, and they wanted to get something like ice. I don't remember exactly what. But she jumped on the back of a friend's motorcycle to run to the store, and I'm sure that was her first experience on a motorcycle. I personally believe that she wanted the experience so she could write about it. I was the daring one that would have been on the motorcycle. Friends here in Charlotte and family were shocked that she was on a motorcycle. So that is one thing. But she wasn't wearing a helmet. Helmets weren't required at that time. And I think that makes a big difference, too.
Yeah.
A car failed to yield right away and threw both of her and the guy off of the motorcycle. She was tossed and thrown and landed on her head. He survived the accident.
Oh, how incredibly sad and tragic. How was your family? What happened to your family after that? That must have been, I mean, I have no words.
It was really pretty devastating, and I was about 17 or 18, and I did not understand the finality of death. I kept thinking on some level that it really wasn't final, that she would, appear. I mean, that was what I felt, even though I knew reality. But I held on to that for a long time. That was the first death I had experienced that I really felt in years. Maybe my grandmother.
I mean, would rather have her alive, but at least she managed to write all this beautiful literature, which will always survive her, will always bring back what was in her and what she was thinking and how she saw the world. That is, I think, the miracle of creation, of art. And
And the way she could bring out characters.
Yes.
I mean, I knew some of them, and she described them to a T.
Her writing is so vivid. Everything, every detail is so incredibly real, but not only in the sense that it is realistic, but she chose to describe the details or to bring in the details that mattered. And only great writers know how to do that. She chose just the bits of speech, people saying just a few words here and there, an image or a sound or a scene, just, a bit of something and a bit of something there, but all together. They're not fragments. They are actually a whole world that she created in her stories. What a talent your sister was. And
I am so thankful that she was here 22 years, and it must have been to bring us her gift of writing, because she was an amazing writer.
Yeah.
And I see it more now. I think when she first started writing stories, I was a slow bloomer, late bloomer. And I didn't really get her stories when I read them the first time. But once I got them, I got them. They were awesome.
Awesome. Absolutely awesome. They're absolute
made
gems.
Me think. Her stories always made me think. When I was younger, I was looking for an ending to her stories. But yet the ending was that you are supposed to think.
Do you feel when you read her stories, because you're not just any reader, you are her sister, do you feel like you're having a conversation?
I do. I mean, and knowing, and I can see where she's thrown me into some of the stories, or herself, and I get a kick out of that. Yeah. Like, that's me.
Which bit in particular did you see as yourself?
Well, in the story about baby cakes, in I think it's The Key to the City, my nickname was Baby Cakes at one point, not after I was big, but when I was a young child. I was a kid who couldn't keep food on her stomach. I was the one that, and like she said, the wax papers didn't really get you clean in the bathrooms, which were our only choices. There weren't many places that we could stop. So if you could get to a bathroom, you didn't have anything to use but maybe wax paper from lunch box.
I feel like I could talk to you forever about your sister and her writing, but I also feel that what you told me is kind of enough to picture her and to bring her to the attention of more and more readers via our podcast and the article that I will write about her as well on my Substack. Cheryl Oliver, thank you very much for joining us on Shop Talk with Writers to speak about your sister Diane Oliver and her book Neighbors and Other Stories. Thank you.
Look, it was my pleasure, Elena, and so glad to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you for allowing me to share my sister to the world.
Do you live close to where you grew up?
Well, I'm in the house that I'm on the property of the land that I grew up on. My daughter and her husband built a house on it. They tore down the house I grew up in, and they built another house.
Oh, how wonderful.
On this property, and they have a carriage house behind it.
And how has that area changed?
It's more like a city than a big country town. Charlotte is growing. I mean, it's not New York, don't get me wrong. But compared to a big country town that I grew up in, it's like now we have a little skyline that started coming in 80s, and they're still growing. I think it's going to get as big as Atlanta, even though I don't want it to.
Wow.
But I think it's on the way. But I like it in the size it is right now.
How old would Diane be
today? She would have been 82 in July.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, for her 80th year or 80 plus year, I think it's a gift that she's being read again.
I think I have used every word in the book since I met Elise. I don't have any more words. I'm worded out. It's awesome. It's amazing. I'm in awe of it.
Fantastic.
And I'm alive to see it, which makes it even, I'm just so glad. Maybe that's my purpose here, to get her stories out.
My second guest is the American translator and editor Ann Goldstein, who is famous for her superb translations of Italian novelist Elena Ferrante, a writer who prefers to remain anonymous. We spoke about Ann Goldstein's new translation of the Italian novel There Is No Turning Back by Italian novelist Alba de Cespedes, one of Ferrante's favorites. This anti-fascist, strongly feminist novel originally appeared to great acclaim before it was censored in 1938 in Mussolini's Italy. It is the story of a group of young women friends whose lives reflect the limitations and challenges, but also joys of their times. Ann Goldstein offers fascinating insights into this radical author's relevance today and about her own journey as a literary translator. Ann Goldstein, welcome to Shop Talk with Writers. In this case, we have a translator and editor to talk to us about a book called There's No Turning Back by Italian-Cuban novelist Alba de Cespedes. Before we talk about the book, I'd love to talk about you. What was your journey into becoming a translator? You've been an editor, you've done lots of things.
First of all, thank you for having me. Nice to meet you. Well, it was kind of a chance journey. I started learning Italian. Actually, I read Dante when I was in college. This is the long story, the long version. And I wanted to read it in Italian. I had this ambition to read Dante in Italian.
Why?
And because I thought Dante was amazing.
Yeah.
I thought it was like, when you're in college, you're 20, 19, and it's like a searching time. And the Divine Comedy is like a search. And it somehow was very, I don't know what you would say, resonated. It was very important to me, that other search, Dante's search. And I thought that if I could read it in Italian, I don't know what I thought, but I just developed this intense wish to read it in Italian. I knew French and I knew Latin, so I could sort of puzzle it out, but I thought, well, what if I actually knew the language? But it was an ambition that was not fulfilled for really almost 15 years or so. And then I was working at the New Yorker, and I convinced some of my colleagues that they too wanted to read Dante in Italian. And we learned Italian. We had a teacher, and we spent a year learning Italian, and then we read the Divine Comedy. I mean, we spent a long time doing it, but we did it.
At the New Yorker?
At the New Yorker. Yeah, because in those days, they thought it was good for people to take classes, and it was, that it was, it was any kind of class that you took, really, no matter what your job, was something that would make you better at your job, and they paid for these classes. So it was those were the golden years, I guess.
Do you think that would still happen today? Anyway,
no, I know it wouldn't happen. I know it wouldn't happen at the New Yorker. I mean, I doubt that I imagine there aren't many places where that would happen. People just, they're so especially. Well, I mean, at least in these kinds of jobs, everybody's so strapped for money that they're not going to pay for cash. And I doubt whether it's, I don't know. I mean, I just don't think it's probably as people pay for their own classes, I guess, or they don't take classes.
So your job at the New Yorker at the time was, you were the head of the copy editing department, am I right?
That's right. Yeah, I was about to become. Yes, I was the head of the copy editing department.
Copy editing at the New Yorker is an awe-inspiring enterprise. It's just such perfection.
It is. I mean, it's not what we call copy editing. Is kind of more like line editing in other places. We really are looking. We were reading things and looking for. I mean, not only grammar, spelling, punctuation, but also if things didn't make sense, if something didn't seem logical, really you could query, and every comment was in the form of a query. You could query anything really as a what we call, there are like three or four different categories of copy editor, but let's say the people that I was sort of in charge of, that's what we did. And they're called okayers.
So I read that you were John Updike's editor?
And then I also edited some writers. And yes, for a while I edited his book reviews, not his fiction. And yeah, that was amazing.
So having been in that role, editor of writers, and now your translations are also edited. How do you feel in the position of someone who is being edited by another editor?
Of course I don't like it. No, because what I write is perfect. No, I mean, good editing is so helpful. It really is. I think that it shows you, it points out a blind spot or an infelicity. I mean, it's really, it's invaluable, and it doesn't always happen that way. But that's what a good editor is, I think.
So this was a very illustrious career. And how did you then become a translator? Was it through your love of Italian that you gradually became interested in actually rendering those texts into English?
Well, actually, it was very accidental. And I think almost every translator I know has a kind of accidental story.
Yeah.
But I was, after I'd been studying Italian for about 5 years, the editor of The New Yorker, Robert Gottlieb, was given a book by a writer called Aldo Buzzi, from his friend Saul Steinberg, the artist. And anyway, Bob didn't read Italian, and so he handed me the book and said, "Can you just tell me what I can say to Saul? Give me something to say to Saul." And so I looked at the book, and it was really kind of fascinating, and I just decided that I would try to translate it just for the hell of it. I mean, just not quite for the hell of it, but because I thought it would give me another insight into Italian, and which it did. And this writer is someone no one's ever heard of, but he's actually quite a really wonderful writer. Anyway, I translated the book, and then it was a very short book, and then it was published, and that was sort of the beginning of my career. and then I did both. I mean, I translated, and I worked at the New Yorker for many years, and then till I decided I'd had enough of the New Yorker.
About a year and a half ago, I was asked by an editor at Washington Post to review her side of the story, a novel by Alba de Cespedes. Am I pronouncing it correctly, by the way?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah.
And at the time, I had no idea who she was. None. I had never heard of her. Mm-hmm. And she said, "Don't worry, you'll love her." So indeed I did. I read this book. This was translated by another translator,
yes.
Jill Folston, and I found it fascinating. And it's a very long novel. I immersed myself in it. I really enjoyed that world. And that was the first time I'd ever heard of her. And that was the first time I kind of looked into her very interesting fascinating, really, life. And now I am looking at There's No Turning Back, translated by yourself. And there's an interesting kind of link between these books and your famous translations of Elena Ferrante, because apparently, and this is what the Washington Post let me and the entire world know, her side of the story was on Elena Ferrante's, or is on Elena Ferrante's night table. She loves it. Something to that effect. So it was influential for her. And so I thought that's very interesting, the connection between, shall we say, feminist writing from the 1930s, 1940s, and even later by one author, and the kind of writing that Elena Ferrante produces now, or has been producing for the last, I suppose, decade or longer. Do you see why Alba de Cespedes would be influential for a writer like Elena Ferrante?
I do. I mean, I think that it's all about, Alba de Cespedes is writing all about, I mean, what we might call the liberation of women. and certainly Ferrante is also writing about that. I mean, about women's lives in a pretty heavy patriarchy, and how they're trying to escape that, really, and to figure out who they are and what's theirs in life, not dictated by men, mostly men.
It would be interesting to contemplate to what degree that world has changed for women in Italy and perhaps elsewhere, because maybe not that much. Or
I think that's true.
I think that's true.
Sadly.
Well, let's start. If you could, I'd love to hear about Alba de Cespedes' very interesting origins and life. She was Cuban Italian, wasn't she?
Yes.
Was she Cuban on her grandfather's side?
Yeah. She came from a very illustrious Cuban family. Her grandfather was the first president of Cuba. Her father also served as president of Cuba, and they were her grandfather fought in the Cuban Revolution, so they were very influential as sort of as revolutionaries.
Yeah.
But she grew up in Italy, actually.
Was she fully bilingual?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
But
although, Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just wondering, did she write in Spanish at all?
No, she was actually trilingual. She also grew up speaking French, and she did write in French later in life. She wrote, I forget which story, a couple of books that she wrote originally in French and then translated into Italian herself. And she ended up living in France.
Yes, ultimately. She married for the first time at the age of 15?
Yes.
And did she have a child in that marriage?
She had a child, yes.
At what age?
I forget. She had a child when she was maybe 18 or 19, if that. Yeah.
Because these themes certainly make it into her narratives and pop up in very interesting ways in the lives of the women and girls that she depicts. Well, this novel is set in a sort of convent/residence boarding house in Rome. It was published in 1938, but was probably written earlier. We could say it's about the 1934, the years 1934.
Yeah, 34 to 36, I think.
And at this point, Mussolini had already been in power for about 10 years.
Yeah, since the early 20s, yeah.
And yet there is no mention of the fascist party in the book by that word. But would you say it is somehow present anyway?
I'd say it's totally present, yeah. I mean, I think that was the one of the atmospheric, what would you call it, clouds for women, was the sort of the fascist emphasis on, wife and mother kind of thing. and on, I mean, it's not overt the way it is in her side of the story, which is obviously about, much more literally about fascism and resistance. But I think that the women in this book are resisting, and even whether they're conscious of it or not, they're resisting this kind of fascist order where everything is controlled, and especially women's lives. And there is there's the one of the, if I'm not getting ahead of things, one of the women is Spanish, and there's a lot of talk of the Spanish Civil War. So that's in a way, the more overt side of talking about fascism and how they're all against it.
But do you think this not mentioning fascism overtly was dictated by the danger of mentioning it, or was it an artistic choice?
I think it was an artistic choice, actually. I mean, I don't really know, but I think it was an artistic choice. I think it was, well, maybe it was a combination, but I think that it's so artful not to mention fascism, but to feel that it's present
in every one of those women's lives.
Yeah, exactly, in different ways.
What I was wondering about was to what extent those norms were dictated by fascism, and to what extent they were simply dictated also by the norms of traditional Italian, specifically.
I don't know how to. I don't really know how to divide that. I guess I'm not.
So this is a story of 8 women. This is a story of 8 women who, at one point, come to live at this residence, shall we call it, and they are studying at the university in Rome, different subjects, and they're living at this residence run by nuns under very strict rules. They often say, this is not a prison, but in fact, it is a sort of prison because they don't have much freedom. And they start out by, having these friendships and revealing a little bit of themselves to this group of friends. Jumping sort of outside of this conversation for a moment, did this remind you of The Group by Mary McCarthy?
Well, it has been mentioned, yeah.
This novel begins in a very sort of subdued way. They are just getting to know each other. They're meeting in each other's rooms in the evenings. They talk and they explore who they are, where they come from, what their stories are. And I felt that this novel really matures as they mature.
That's
as a work of art. And I think it's a much better novel than the one I reviewed, which was excellent. I think it's a much better novel. It's so much more cohesive, and the way it flows from one character to another is just absolutely brilliant. She was very young when she wrote it. She had already published some, hadn't she?
Yeah, she published some stories. She published this sort of not a real novel, like a novella kind of thing. Poems. She'd also published, I think, some poems. But yeah, it's an amazing kind of what would you call it? The way she goes from the different characters is, I think, incredible.
And throughout the book, I felt that the women's lives, whoever they are and wherever they come from, were carved out kind of almost as if they were on their own, with the men in the background. The men as fathers, as fiancés, as sex partners, as admirers, as abusers, brothers, other family members. They are all there and they do that, but they're sort of like shadowy figures in the background. The women are completely at the forefront of everything that's happening. Do you think that there is something of the author in one or the other of these characters more than another, or is it a combination?
I really think it's a combination. I think what I think is interesting is, among many things, I mean, I think Emanuela is probably the closest to the author. For one thing, she's the only one with a child, and the author had a child at that point. But I think if you take her third novel, Forbidden Notebook, and you think of the main character in that, I think that character embodies something from each of these 8 characters. I feel as if Alba de Cespedes, when she got to the Forbidden Notebook, she really had a character who was more universal or something, but that she kind of started out with these 8 different women who then.
Who are they? So Emanuela is someone who'd had an early love affair, although she wasn't convinced at the time that it was that, but she became pregnant, she lost that young man, and her whole life is then determined by keeping a secret.
Right.
And then there's Sylvia, who is the most interesting, erudite, intellectual of them all, really apparently only interested in texts and literature and studying and academia and becoming not just a teacher but an academic thinker. And then there's Valentina, who is wonderfully obsessed with sexual fantasies. I'd love to know how Italian critics and readers responded to Valentina at the time, because that was very explicit, wasn't it?
Exactly. I know. I actually wondered that myself. I don't really know. But yes, it's very explicit. It's really kind of astonishing.
It's beautifully done, because you feel like you're in that room with her when she's visited, in quotes, by her fantasy prince. And it's completely sexually clear that she has had that fantasy since her childhood.
Yeah.
So I think this is just brilliantly written. And then there's Augusta. Now Augusta is trying to be a novelist. And isn't that interesting, Anne, how she writes romantic trash. And Emanuela thinks this is clearly written by someone who hasn't had any experience whatsoever. And she has, so she knows what she's talking about. And then there comes a point where Augusta, because everything is getting rejected, nothing is getting published, so she's quite desperate, where she says, well, my next novel is about basically the rights of women, rebelling against the society controlled by men. And she becomes more and more like a man in her behavior. Yeah. What do you think that was about?
I don't know, but it's kind of interesting that she can't get published. Whereas, of course, her creator did get published.
Yeah.
And I just found that so, well, actually, it's sort of so hard to say which story is more heartbreaking than the other. But that's one of the ones that I think is really difficult. Actually, they're all difficult in a way. But I think that De Cespedes was just, I mean, it's true that there were popular women novels. There were successful women novelists. I mean, other successful women novelists, I think. I mean, there were. But I think she's also representing, I mean, what's important to her is to represent the struggle that women have against not only, not being able to get published, but against their own, their own difficulties, their struggle against the hardships of their own life and the way that they've been formed. But it's like Augusta she has to write these things. Not that it's all she knows, but it's all she imagines somehow. It's what's dictated to her by the society. This is what women do.
What do you think of Xenia? How would you pronounce it?
I don't, Xenia, I guess, but yeah. I'm not sure.
very interesting character who leaves
Right.
the residence, escapes, and doesn't really know what she's going to do. She just needs to get out and get away from where she comes from, which is a simple village somewhere. Her parents mortgaged their field, I believe, to pay for her school.
Their vineyard, I think.
And yeah. And she's very smart, but at some point she decides this is not for me, and she just gets out. And her ascent to becoming, to going from nothing to becoming quite a wealthy so-called baroness. This is very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, but also, I mean, it's sort of like Valentina, like her sexual experience is also very graphic. I mean, graphic. The description of how she feels when this guy is putting his hands on her is really distressing.
Yeah.
But it's sort of like that's the price she's paying for wealth and position. And so it's kind of a grim view of things.
Yeah, she's basically like a very, very almost intellectual prostitute.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, kept woman, as they used to say.
Kept woman was the term. What's very interesting about the friendships among those women, between and among these women, is that initially they're very devoted and dedicated to each other. And as time goes by, they discover that they don't really know each other, that each one is an island unto herself and doesn't really reveal that much about herself to others. And they are even angry about it at some point. And I think Alba de Cespedes has a way of drawing her characters, her female characters, in such a way that they are always reflecting on who they are and what their choices are, how they never just do something, go somewhere, say something. They always think about it, discuss it, and just philosophically really are very rich and deep, and they take the time to consider what things mean, what life means, and what life is. And it just made me very, very sad to think that in the 1930s, no matter what they did, it wasn't going to end well for any of them. Well, I wanted to ask you, you wrote in your translator's note at the beginning of the book about the astonishing way this book was published by Mondadori in 1938. Can you tell us about that campaign?
Yes. This was very unusual. Mondadori, I don't know, he really liked the book and he thought it would be successful, and so he set up a whole big advertising campaign of sending the book to critics, making translation contracts, advertising it in, there's that one detail of how he sent around a truck with a big placard on it advertising the book. I mean, it was very unusual for a book by a young writer, an unknown young writer, but it was a smart move because it sold a lot of copies. I mean, it was very popular when it came out, and then it was banned by the fascists. It was they didn't like all that freedom for women.
But even though it was banned, it continued to be reprinted.
Yes.
The guise of it still being the old printing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which is great.
I know. That was a great detail that I found somewhere. I don't remember where.
This was an incredible campaign. I mean, today, a publisher would only do that for an already established best-selling author. Yeah. And not even then. I mean, with billboards and, a letter to critics.
Right. Fantastic. It was very unusual. Yeah.
And she had been jailed, I think, once or twice
Yes, I think so, although briefly.
Briefly. But during the war, I'm going to play you something. Hold on. Now tell me, is this her voice?
Credete di non poter far nulla, voi, chiuse nel giro della vostra vita consueta, casa e ufficio, casa e ufficio. Credete. E invece io vi dico che potete, voi, proprio voi, col vostro grembiulino nero, davanti alla vostra macchina.
I found it on YouTube because I read that she was a regular contributor to Radio Bari during the war, sabotaging, fascist and German war efforts. And so I thought, well, there must be a recording somewhere. I found this.
That's amazing, because I thought the same thing. I thought there must be something, but I didn't spend a long time looking, and I didn't find anything.
Well, this is just a minute of it. And you know what's very interesting as well? Her name on that, shall we say, program, it wasn't a program, her sort of cover name was Clorinda.
Clorinda, right.
And Clorinda, Tancredi and Clorinda appear in the novel as well as the two lovers who are fighting in a battle and don't recognize each other until they do. And this relates to one of the protagonists' early love. And I thought that was very interesting. I wonder if she herself gave, used the name Clorinda for that reason, because she'd already used it in the novel and it meant something to her.
Well, I think she definitely chose the name.
Yeah.
And yes, and partly because she'd used it in the novel, but partly because the name just meant something to her. It had a woman warrior, really.
Exactly. She was, to me, Alba de Cespedes, everything she's done, she was a warrior. All her writing, all her editing. She was a warrior for others and for herself, and she looked for causes where she could be meaningfully, engaged, and she was, whether it was writing or other activities. It's very interesting. I'm not sure what to think of her sort of friendship with Fidel Castro.
Yeah, well, right. I don't know. Those were other times.
Yes, but what I found really interesting is that she traveled so much. She was even an ambassador's wife at some point, so she represented Italy in America, and then she chose to live in Paris, didn't she? Because, do you know what her reasons were for that?
I don't really know. I tried to look into that at some point. She was uncomfortable in Rome for some reason or other, which I don't really know. I don't know. It's not clear to me why she moved to Paris. I think she was spending more time there, and I think she was kind of separated from her second husband.
Yeah.
So I think she just
one
liked
of the
better,
documentaries says that she loved being in Paris because it was at that time, post-war, we're talking 60s, 70s, 80s. It was the heart of what was really happening in the world, in a very sort of revolutionary upheaval sort of way, and that she and culturally she was very interested in what was happening. So she loved being at the center of things, didn't she?
Yeah, she did. I mean, and she was in 1930s and 40s Italy.
Yeah,
she was very much in the center of things, in the literary center of things in Rome.
Have you explored the literary magazine she edited, Mercurio?
I've looked at that. It's amazing. Did you look at some copies of it? It's online, actually. You can get it. You can look at it. It's got every famous Italian writer or every well-known important Italian writer of the period published in it, including a lot of women. And it's pretty great.
So she was a brilliant editor as well.
She was. I mean, it's amazing that she was able to do that. I mean, right after the war. In fact, the war wasn't even over when she started.
Yeah.
And that she got people to contribute and also artists.
Of course, that she wrote a screenplay for this film called Friends or Girlfriends.
Oh, yes, I do know.
Was it Vittoria De Sica?
I think so.
And so that was a full screenplay. Well, I found on eBay there's a manuscript written. They claim, and I believe, in her handwriting, for a film. It's a treatment, really. It's not a full screenplay, like a treatment for a feature film about this boxer, which is another of her books, isn't it? What's it called?
That's the one. That's the early one. The early
one, yeah.
That early book. I don't remember the name.
So this is available for about €100.
Oh.
And I have no idea how these things kind of suddenly appear on eBay, but it is there.
Huh.
And
well, she has a huge archive.
Yeah.
At Mondadori.
Yeah. How do you explain that a writer of such magnitude, who was so loved, translated, published, people really, really engaged with her writing on so many levels, how did she then become forgotten and is now being revived?
I can't answer that question. I mean, why was she forgotten? There are many, many women writers, in particular in Italy, who were forgotten of that period, who had their fame and were forgotten. I mean, Elsa Morante was forgotten basically for a while, practically. But I think that's somehow certainly it's true in America as well, that there were many writers of this time of this period that were just kind of forgotten and are being revived. Or in England, remember Virago bringing out all those writers who we didn't know that were so wonderful?
Of course.
I don't know how that happens. I guess new people take over.
I'm a case in point of someone who had never heard of her, and now I can't believe that I never heard of her until recently.
But many Italians hadn't heard of her either.
Really?
Until she was brought back. Yeah. I hadn't heard of her until Ferrante. Until I read about her in Ferrante.
I see.
That's how I knew about her.
And how do you think? How would you explain her incredible relevance today?
I mean, it's sort of a depressing story, don't you think?
Yes, let's get depressed here.
I mean that in certain ways things haven't changed. That even if externally, of course, women are able to do many more things than they were able to do in the 1930s and 40s, but there's still this feeling that, and as we all know, it's coming back to again even more strongly that women aren't fit for certain things, or women can't do this, or women have to define themselves by some standard that isn't organic, that isn't our own standard. But I mean, I don't know. There's other things to be said about it. But there are ways in which we're still hampered, I think, by the fact that men control things.
Do you think women are better at being open with each other?
Yes, that's certainly true. I mean, I think everybody's better at being open with each other, or many people are better at being open. I mean, I don't know.
I'm not so sure, because when I think about the Sex and the City stories, they seem to be very involved in each other's lives in the most intimate details, but there's always something that they keep to themselves and they kind of withhold. I mean, these are television characters, but there is a kind of withholding there that I think was also present in this novel.
Yeah, that's true.
I was wondering, would you feel comfortable reading a little passage from this book for us in Italian and in English?
Sure. Al Grimaldi era stata tradita dall'illusione di una rinascita. Si era sentita giovane come non era stata mai, essendo figlia unica di genitori anziani che vivevano da vecchi. Andrea non poteva capire che nel fingersi altra lei stessa si credeva tale. Voleva assaporare così un'età di cui i genitori, mediante le loro abitudini, l'avevano defraudata. Inoltre le sue compagne possedevano l'innocenza di quelle classi che si divertono con nulla e che lei era anch'essa sconosciuta. At the Grimaldi, she had been betrayed by the illusion of a rebirth. She had felt young in a way that she never had been, as the only daughter of old parents who lived like old people. Andrea couldn't understand that she herself, pretending to be something else, believed she was that. She wanted to experience an age that her parents, because of their habits, had cheated her of. Besides, her friends possessed the innocence of those classes that can enjoy themselves with very little, and to her that too was unknown.
Thank you so much. Can I ask you how you feel about being the translator of great writers, Elena Ferrante and others?
I feel lucky. I mean, it's always, you feel it's a little bit of a burden because you want to be at the level of the writer. But yes, I feel very fortunate that I've been able to kind of immerse myself in these writers.
So when you said you wanted to read Dante in the original, the translation wasn't good enough for you?
It's not even that. I mean, there's a million Dante translations, and I've read quite a few of them. It's just that there's something about being in the original language that, especially with poetry, that you can't get from reading it in a translation. I mean, people say that if you read 5 different translations of a poem, you may get to something about the poem, but you would never have the same sounds, for example.
So I felt when I read this book in your translation, I felt I was reading 2 writers, the author of the novel and the author of this incredible, impeccable, beautiful translation, Ann Goldstein. And I would like to really thank you for that, because you've opened for so many readers a way to rediscover her and others. I come from, my father was a translator, so I grew up with.
Oh wow.
And I hated the fact that he was a translator, because he was always typing. He was not approachable. He was always typing, always translating. And at some point, because I grew up with many languages and I learned more languages, and people say, oh, you're going to be a translator. It's a natural for you. And my father told me when I was very young that you can translate from any language, but you can only translate into your own native language.
Yeah.
And I kind of lost my native language. It took me a while to start thinking of English as my language, which then became my writer's language, and a language into which I have translated a few things. But that really kept me away from even wanting to do it. And he himself said he can only translate prose, never poetry.
Yeah, I'm with that.
Because he can't, he couldn't write poetry, and therefore, but his own style was stunning. It was beautiful. It was very literary. It was very precise. He had a tone, a music to it, but he never wrote,
Oh.
And so I was wondering, do you also write?
No, I mean, except introductions and things. Translator
That's not
notes.
something you want to do?
No, not really.
What do you think of the mindset that you bring to being a translator? Is it easier than writing, or is it kind of the same, except it's all mapped out for you?
Well, it is. I mean, It is kind of the same in a way. I mean, you are after all writing something, but it's true, you don't have to think of what the character's going to say. I mean, you do have to think of what the character's going to say in a certain sense, but in a different way. I mean, especially in Italy and probably France too. I don't know about America or England, but many writers used to be translators also.
Yeah.
And I think that was probably important for them as writers. And someone was saying, I forget who was, some translator recently was saying that all writers should be made to translate something at least once in their life.
Yes, I agree. That's very true. I heard in another interview with you that you became Elena Ferrante's translator because you won a sort of competition of sample translations.
Yeah.
Were you ever told why yours was the winning one?
No, nobody ever explained it to me. I mean, I eventually knew who the other people were, but and they're all very good translators.
Do you think there is such a thing as a woman's voice in writing?
I know we all like to say there isn't, but I think that maybe there is. I don't know. I mean, I don't mean it in the sense that only women should translate women and women should only translate women or men should only translate men. But I suppose there is kind of a woman's voice, or maybe just a voice of that has a particular experience that is somehow conveyed in that voice.
Well, I am very, very grateful for this conversation with you, Anne. I think you are a superstar.
Oh my goodness.
As a translator, hidden behind the amazing authors who you translate.
Yeah.
But people should know your name, and they should know what an art it is that you bring to these books and make them accessible to international English language. I mean, readership all over the world. So thank you so much, Ann Goldstein, for speaking to Shop Talk with Writers.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Shop Talk with Writers. In this episode called Resurrections, we introduced Diane Oliver's stunning short story collection, Neighbors and Other Stories, published by Faber and Grove Atlantic, and the Italian novel There Is No Turning Back by Alba de Cespedes, translated by Ann Goldstein, published by Washington Square Press and Pushkin Press. My very generous guests were Diane Oliver's sister Cheryl Oliver and Alba de Cespedes translator Ann Goldstein. Please read my Substack piece on elenalappin.substack.com about the writers I interview for much more background, photos, and information. And if you enjoy the podcast, please show your support by liking and commenting on our episodes, following us on Instagram, and subscribing to my Substack. Thank you for listening.